Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's 1 o'clock now, so we're going to go ahead and get started. First of all, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about how you can best combine the New York State Homeowner Historic Tax Credit Program with commercial or income-producing historic tax credits to really get the value out of your investments. We're really excited to be able to bring this program to you today. And just a few housekeeping things before we get started. If you have a question as we go along, go ahead and feel free to type it into the Q&A box, and we'll go ahead and answer those at the end of the program. Also, at the very end of the program, we can hopefully have some of you raise your hands and give you the opportunity to speak. And that way we can get some live questions answered as well. Couple other things, we are currently recording this, so if there's anything you'd like to go back and see at a later date, there will be a recording available, and we will also provide all the slides to you if there's further information or reading that you would like to do, along with some other resources that we think you'll find really helpful. So shortly, I'm going to be joined by Mike Puma. He's one of the partners at Preservation Studios in Buffalo, New York. We're really excited to have him do a deep dive into historic tax credits and give you some information on the best way to combine these historic tax credit programs. So before we do that, I just wanted to give a brief overview of a little bit of our work here at the Preservation League. I apologize if you were with us for our last webinar. This might be a little review for you, but we did want to give you an idea of what we do as an organization. We are your New York statewide historic preservation nonprofit organization. We are a professional staff of 9 at the moment, and we do work for historic preservation all over New York State, which includes all 62 counties. So a little bit about what we do here. Our focus areas here at the League consist of a number of programs. First of which is very important to doing our statewide work is our Preservation Colleagues group. We have colleagues all across New York State in different regions, and we really rely heavily on these folks to really be our boots on the ground and tell us what important historic preservation concerns they have in their areas. And we really lean on these folks to tell us what it is that we should be concerned about in a multitude of preservation areas. We also have a robust technical services and outreach program where folks can contact us, whether that be an individual resident who has a house issue they're trying to solve a problem with, or whether that's a municipality looking to engage us for historic preservation advice and planning advice. We're certainly always open to hear from these folks and do what we can to assist them with their particular issues. Right now, I did want to mention that we have a current call out for our annual Excellence Awards programs, and this is where we honor great projects and preservation initiatives all across New York State. So we are currently accepting nominations until June 19th, and if you know of any great projects happening in your area, please don't hesitate to reach out to us and let us know. Other ways we try to help communities are through protecting our threatened resources that are important to many different people, organizations, and places. So we do this with our biennial 7 to Save list, where we can highlight these threatened resources and advocate for their protection. Now, a lot of what I do is in our public policy area, and we advocate at the federal, state, and local levels for historic preservation with our legislators. And one of the things we work quite heavily on are historic tax credits. And you're going to hear a bunch more about how great they are today. But one of the things that's really important is, always letting your government know what's important to you and why. And tax credits are just one of those things that are incredibly important for many reasons, which we'll get into later. Other things that we do, we have a grant program that's called EPIP, and through this program, we're able to offer loans for projects that might not otherwise be able to acquire a loan at a low interest rate for historic properties. So that's one thing we're pleased to offer, as well as our grant programs. Our signature grant programs are our Preserve New York and Technical Assistant grants, which are offered in partnership with the New York State Council on the Arts. These programs really provide us a way to reach projects and channel funding in a way that is so beneficial to these historic sites. Now, I did want to mention that our grant programs, our signature grant programs, are only available to nonprofits and municipalities. So while we get a lot of questions about, what grants we can offer, we typically get questions from people looking to rehab their own private properties and wondering what grants we have. And unfortunately, unless you are a nonprofit or a municipality, that's not something we can fund with our current grant programs. That being said, we definitely want to make sure people are aware of them, and also for you guys to keep up with us, because things are changing constantly and you never know when we're going to have new and different funding opportunities. So just to give you an overview of our Preserve New York grant program, while it might not help you for your personal or business investment, we know many of you are active in your communities, whether that be on a board or planning level. So it is an important thing to know, so you can pass along this information in case you know someone that might be eligible for one of our grants. So again, nonprofits and municipalities can apply, and we have 4 different types of surveys that our Preserve New York grant program funds. First is going to be a cultural resource survey. We see a lot of these come in. This is just to get a survey of your inventory of historic resources in your municipality, determine the historic significance, find out what's important to you, and then go from there. We can also look at, there's several levels of that. So it can be a reconnaissance survey, which is kind of an overall survey. We can get a little bit deeper in terms of an intensive level survey, or we can do a survey with the strict focus being a state and a national register nomination, which again will tie into historic tax credits in terms of making that property eligible for historic tax credits. Next, we fund building condition reports, which is going to be a comprehensive study of what kind of condition your building is. And there's a building that's been sitting for a while, we're not sure what's going on with it. This is going to be really important to see what the building looks like and what we might be able to do to rehab it. Next, we can fund a historic structure report, which is a comprehensive condition analysis of the structure, plus some research about its history. So there's something that you have in your community that has a deep history, or there's some folklore surrounding it, that's something that you might want to find out and would be part of a historic structure report. And then last but not least, we can also fund cultural landscape reports, which are similar to historic structure reports, but they're specific to a landscape. So this is going to be your cemetery or your public park, and it's going to determine the significance and also can help determine proper treatment and care for a property going forward. Our technical assistance grants are our smaller grant system. This only goes up to a $4,000 max award, opposed to the previous one, which goes up to $10,000. And this is going to be more of a specific grant program. It can also fund building condition surveys, but it serves a very specific purpose. It might be a very specific part of the building versus the entire building. It can also fund structural analysis, which is really important for reusing a structure. It can fund a feasibility or reuse study, as well as handicapped accessibility, which of course is really important in public buildings and institutions, as well as mechanical, electrical, and plumbing analysis. One thing that we see a lot of are needs for fire suppression in public buildings, and also HVAC, central cooling and heating, is also incredibly important. So that's just a few things of what we do. I didn't want to spend all day on that, but I wanted to give a quick overview because we do get a lot of questions on it. And just to get you guys ready, thinking into historic tax credits, how important are historic tax credits? Why do we advocate for them? Well, it's one of few financial incentives for historic preservation. It preserves architecture unique to a community and provides us all a sense of place that we're desperately looking for. It also serves to encourage private reinvestment and revitalizes our communities from the ground up. It's common sense development for New York State, and for dollar investing, you're investing in New York State rehabilitation at the local level. And to that point, it drives economic development in New York State and creates jobs, whether those jobs are temporary construction jobs, or you're thinking further down the road and you're creating a commercial site or retail space that is then going to employ people for years and years to come. And then lastly, sustainability. We talk a lot about reusing the existing building stock, maintaining the embodied energy in those buildings. They're made with quality materials. It keeps them out of landfills. And particularly here in New York State, we have an incredibly robust climate-based energy initiative with a goal for 2030. And that's going to lead to you know, those good outcomes that we're looking for on the sustainability front. So it really ties in everything. There's really a little bit of something for everyone. So here's just some information on how to reach out to us. Again, we're going to take questions live at the end, hopefully. So if you don't think you'll remember your question, go ahead and use the Q&A feature at any time during the presentation. If not, feel free to raise your hand at the end. My information's up there, as well as all the ways to stay in touch with the League. Please feel free to sign up for our email so you can get the latest on information, tax credits, grants, and everything else that's going to be affecting you. Again, we're so glad today to be joined by Mike Puma. He's one of the partners at Preservation Studios in Buffalo, New York. And at Preservation Studios, they work with building owners, municipalities, and community groups to assist with historic tax credit projects, National Register listings, and survey historic district work. So we're really excited to hear from Mike. So I'm going to turn it over to him, and he's going to tell you everything you need to know about combining these credits. Mike, are you with us?
I am, yeah, I'm just trying to get my video turned up here. Let's see if this works. Oh, I don't think I can, no, here we go. Great, okay, cool. Let me pull this up. I think I just need the screen sharing on.
Okay, give me 1 minute, let me make sure that you can.
Okay.
Okay, you should be able to.
Great, okay. All right, I think I've got it. Okay, cool. Let me get this pulled up. Okay, does that look like it's working on your end?
Looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to pause this because it's going to get ahead of me. So as Christina already mentioned, I'm going to talk about both the state and federal historic tax credit program today, but more specifically how to combine them for what we call a hybrid situation, where you have both your primary residence and an income producing unit, or maybe a couple income producing units under the same roof. Just quickly, and Christina touched on a lot of this, but here's some information by the numbers about the benefit of the tax credit program throughout both New York State and the country. New York State's been quite a wide user of the program. We were #1 for a few years in a row. This information is obviously about 2 years out of date now, but I'd imagine we're probably still fairly well up there, if not actually still #1. There's also a preconceived notion that a lot of people bring to the table that preservation is just for wealthy elite folks. In reality, the majority of the work that we do and the majority of the work across New York State and beyond that utilizes historic tax credits also combines it with the low-income housing tax credit to provide quality housing for a whole host of people, low to moderate income folks, senior populations, etc. So a lot of our projects are a combination of the utilization of the historic tax credits with the affordable housing tax credits to create some really wonderful spaces that everybody can enjoy and interact with. It's also a huge job creator, as you can see by the information at the bottom of the slide. So let's talk about some of the information on the New York State homeowner side of things. The program is set up to be relatively straightforward so that most people can apply relatively easily. They've actually just revamped some of the applications, which you'll see later in the presentation. But basically, if you have a full-blown renovation to handle from the top to the bottom, the inside of the out, a full gut, this is a great program. If you're just doing a roof replacement, this is a great program. The more money you spend, obviously, the more you're going to generate in tax credits. And the way the tax credits work is that it's meant to be a dollar for dollar reduction in your state tax liability, and then a dollar for dollar reduction in your federal tax liability for the federal credits. So the way the New York State homeowner tax credit works is that it's 20% of your qualified expenditures, or QREs. And we'll talk a little bit more about what QREs are later on in the presentation, but just to give you a primer on that, it's effectively everything pretty much you can imagine that has to do with the house itself. Your foundation, your exterior, your roofing, windows, hot water tanks, plumbing systems, electrical, forced air systems. If it's the envelope of the house and pretty much everything contained within it, excluding furniture, fixtures, and equipment, they don't want you to earn tax credits on appliances because obviously that doesn't really have much to do with your home on the historic side of things, that's eligible for the program. So if you're going to be rehabilitating your own home to the tune of, say, $100,000, and every dollar of that is eligible for the credits, you're going to be looking at a $20,000 tax credit. The nice thing about the New York State tax credit, which is true of the homeowner side of things, is that it's a refundable credit. So if your adjusted household income is $60,000 or less in the year in which you're filing for your credit, the difference comes back to you in a refund check. So this isn't just a dollar for dollar reduction on your tax return. It actually can be money in your hand coming back from a refund check. The federal credit doesn't work like that, unfortunately. There's no check that shows up. The state credit's pretty wonderful in that way. It does require the property to be homeowner occupied. You have to spend at least $5,000 on the rehabilitation, which again, if you own an old house, if you've worked on your old house, you know it's fairly easy to spend that type of money, whether you want to or not. So a roof is a great example of that. Roof is probably going to be more than $5,000 unless it's an incredibly small roof. It's 100% on the exterior. You need to spend at least 5% of your costs on the exterior somewhere. And you have to get all of your work approved prior to the start of work. The federal credit works a little bit differently than that. It's always safe to get your approvals in place before you start work to make sure you're not doing things that can't be undone and jeopardize the credit down the road. But for the homeowner credit specifically, you have to have your approval from the New York State Historic Preservation Office in place prior to the start of work. There is a cap of $50,000, which means that your project can't exceed $250,000. However, you can actually come back to this program year after year after year, tax year, that is. So if you have a $500,000 project and you spend $250,000 in 2020 and another $250,000 in 2021, you actually can sort of come back to the well there and maximize your tax credit. There is a 2-year recapture period, and the way the recapture period works is that if you sell or transfer the property in less than 2 years from the date you place your project in service, you run the risk of having the prorated value of your tax credits recaptured, which, especially when it comes to a refund check, is something to avoid, because if you've already cashed that check and spent the money, it can get complicated. So I'd imagine that's probably in very few, if not none, of the situations that utilize the homeowner program, just because people are probably staying in their historic houses after they put that much money into it, but something to be aware of. The federal historic tax credits work in a very similar fashion. It's 20% of your qualified rehab expenditures, your QREs. This side of things, it has to be income producing. So it can be a rental apartment, it can be a storefront unit, it can be office, it can be even manufacturing. If you own the building and somebody's paying you rent, it's income producing, and you're then eligible for the additional 20% from the federal historic tax credits. This has a 5-year hold period, also known as the 5-year recapture period. So the same thing applies. If you sell or transfer the property within the 5 years after placing the building in service, you run the risk of the prorated credits coming back out of your account. There is no cap on the federal side currently, so that's obviously a nicer incentive on some of the larger projects, which is why the program is so well used. You have to carry you can carry the credits forward on the federal side 20 years. You can look back 1 year. That gets a little bit complicated, which is why having an accountant on board who's somewhat familiar with the program is always a good idea. Accountants are very important as part of the process here, no matter how simple or complicated your project might be. Unfortunately, with the changes that were made recently, on the federal side of things, now the federal credit has to be taken ratably over 5 years. Previously, you were able to take all of it in the first year. So, the money you're getting in year 5 isn't quite worth as much as the money you were getting in year 1, but it's the way they figured out how their math needed to work for their tax changes at the federal level. New York State also has an income producing program. It works, again, very similarly, same 20%. It's got to be located in a qualified census tract, and there is a great system that the New York State Office of Parks and Recreation has, the CRIS database, that can actually indicate whether or not your property is in a qualified census tract. And a qualified census tract is where the median income is at or below the state median income level. That's not a requirement of the federal program. They basically don't care where the property is. It doesn't have to be in a QCT for it to be eligible. Tax credits above a taxpayer's liability is refundable. Similarly to the homeowner program, if you have more tax credits the year you complete your project than you do have state tax liability, the difference can come back to you in a refund check. There is a cap at the state level of $5 million. Not too many projects hit that cap, but some of the larger ones that I'm sure some folks who are attending might be aware of, they've probably seen that cap get hit. And the carryover is unlimited. These basically just roll forward until you're able to absorb all of them. So let's talk a little bit about how you actually first make the step of getting into the program. So in order to be eligible for both the state and federal historic tax credits, you have to be of some type of designation. A lot of the properties that we work on, especially a lot of individual homes, are in National Register listed historic districts. And for those that are unfamiliar potentially with historic districts, it's effectively a collection of buildings that have a shared historical development. They might have similar architectural styles. They may have similar developmental history, say for like a subdivision neighborhood, or it might be a combination of both of things, which often it is. So you see a lot of downtown historic districts that may just be the commercial core of downtown. Some of those districts were larger to start and have been expanded over the years to include the residential areas. Other historic districts you see are just strictly residential, maybe with some small scale corner store type structures within them. The other way to be eligible is to be individually listed on the National Register. Not many houses fall within this category. Getting a house individually listed on the National Register is actually quite a task. The property has to be exceptionally significant. Usually you're talking about like pretty notable historic figures, like say for presidents or inventors or industrialists. And even then, it would maybe have to be the only remaining example, built example that's tied to that person's individual history. So if you have like an industrialist's house, but their factory where what they produced, which is what made them famous, is still standing, it isn't to say that it makes it impossible for you to list their actual home on the National Register individually, but if it's the only thing remaining, the case is a little bit stronger. So we most often see projects, both at the residential side and commercial side, come into the program because of their location in a larger historic district. Creating a historic district is quite an undertaking. We've done it many, many times for both community groups or advocacy groups. There's more and more being created every year across New York State. So really supporting your advocates that are promoting more historic districts is a very important thing, because it might end up benefiting you in the long run if it hasn't already. The homeowner application process is pretty straightforward. They've really tried their best to make the applications as sensible and as easy to understand as possible. All the instructions are on the applications. They're very straightforward. It's done similarly to the federal credit in 3 parts. The part 1, which basically for the homeowner side of things confirms your building's status either as individually listed on the National Register or, again, most likely a contributing structure in a National Register listed historic district. The part 2 is going to be what's describing your existing conditions from the inside to the outside and what you propose to do to it. And the part 3 comes when everything's complete, which basically just reaffirms that what you had approval for on your rehab is what you did, ideally exactly what you had approval for. So as you can see, the applications are pretty straightforward. Basic information to fill out about the property, your ownership information, is the building in the historic district, are you spending the right amount of money? This is sort of what the part 2 looks like. Again, very straightforward. They give you some quick instructions about what you need to do. You know, if just for an example, you know, roof replacement. So if you go to photo number, let's say you've taken 10 photos of the exterior of your house, you would go photos 1 to 10 in the first box. For title of work proposed, you would say roof replacement, existing condition. Let's just assume right now it's a worn asphalt shingle roof, which is what you put in that box. Proposed work, you'd say replace existing worn asphalt shingle roof with new asphalt shingle in kind, and then estimated cost, let's just say it's $10,000. The other thing that's important to note is that for both the homeowner process and the federal income producing process, it's not often that representatives from the state, and very rarely representatives from the feds, are actually showing up to the property individually. So you need to communicate what the existing conditions from the inside to the outside are in photos. So here we see an example of the typical photos you would use. Ideally, you're getting 1 to 2 at minimum photos of every room in the house, so that you can sort of see, if you take a photo from one corner of a room, you're able to catch 2 out of the 4 walls. And then you're keying that to what can just be a very basic sketch of your overall floor plan, so that the people that are reviewing your application, either at the state level or at the federal level in DC, can understand what the conditions on the ground are, both inside and outside of your house, without actually having to go there. So just to recap, because obviously we're throwing a lot of information at you, the state homeowner credit and the federal credit are both 20%. You can get an additional state 20% on top of the federal income producing credit for 40% credit. So as you can see, obviously you're doubling your money there if you have an income producing property. The state homeowner credit requires it to be a homeowner occupied property, either individually listed on the National Register or in a historic district. It has to be in a qualified census tract. Project costs have to exceed $5,000. You've got to spend at least 5% of your total project cost on the exterior. The SHPO has to approve your work before you start, and there's a 2-year recapture period. The commercial credit, again, is 40% credit, so you're doubling your money there if you have an income producing property. Similarly, either in a historic district or individually listed, your project costs have to exceed the adjusted basis, and that's where people get a little bit tripped up. So we're going to explain adjusted basis in the presentation coming up pretty soon here. Both the state, the SHPO, and the National Park Service have to approve your applications, and this is where things are a little bit different. We tell our clients, ideally, you're not starting work until you get your approval. In reality, work almost always has to outpace the approval process, just because there's so much that goes into the preparation of the documents to actually get through the agencies, and then both agencies have their time frames that they're permitted to review applications in. So it's all about trying to mitigate your risk. There's a lot of things you can do on the strictly commercial tax credit side of things without running the risk of kicking yourself out of the program. Like, if your building's collapsing, you can stabilize it and re-roof it, as long as you're doing in-kind materials to make sure you're covered. Things you shouldn't do, both never and especially before your approval, pull out your historic windows and order your replacement windows. Usually custom windows can't be returned, and you have to demonstrate that your historic windows are beyond repair to start. So that's usually a big no-no. And then on the federal commercial income producing side of things, there's a 5-year recapture period. So this is where things can get a little bit further complicated. A lot of people maybe live in a 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 family property, or maybe they have like a typical building like you're seeing here, this sort of live above the shop storefront type building. And some people have lived in storefronts, which is actually pretty neat the way they've reworked them. But a lot of people end up wanting to lease that space and then live above the shop. So whether you have a row house that was single family that's been cut into 4 units, or some sort of combination of a storefront building with a residential component, there's a lot of different building types that can fall into this situation, or maybe just a traditional 2-family home. So this is where things get a little bit more complicated, and I'm sure we'll probably have questions at the end to try to iron it out. The commercial credits, their costs associated with the portions of the building that are income producing. So again, in this scenario, you've got a first floor storefront. So all the costs associated with that first floor storefront, from the demolition of existing materials to the systems to the build out of the new layout and finishes, those are all eligible for the state 20% credit and the federal 20% credit, i.e. your 40% tax credits. The homeowner credits, which let's for this example assume is the second floor, you're living above the shop, are the costs associated with the homeowner unit. So everything going on up there, you're getting 20% back. So 40% downstairs, 20% upstairs. Then there's a hybrid that happens. So the exterior is obviously protecting both your homeowner side and your commercial side. So there's a blended rate there. So what you need to do is for like roof, windows, siding, foundation, anything that's shared between both your income producing portion and your homeowner portion, you effectively split in half and then multiply 1/2 by 20%, 1/2 by 40%. So again, let's use the roof as an example. $10,000 roof replacement, you know, 10,000 divided by 2 is 5,000. 5,000 times 20% is 1,000. 5,000 times 40% is 2,000. So you're going to get 3,000 of your $10,000 back the way the tax credit's split like that. And one thing to be aware of is that the rehab cost of the commercial component of your project has to exceed the entire building's basis. So this is probably a good time to explain what the basis is. Your adjusted basis is calculated by your acquisition price plus improvements you've made minus depreciation and minus land value. And I think I've got that on a future slide here just to recap. So basically, if you bought a property for $100,000 yesterday, your adjusted basis is probably going to be a little bit less than $100,000. There's no depreciation factored in because you haven't owned it long enough. You've made no improvements to it because you just bought it yesterday. And the land value, I don't know, depending on where you are, if you're in New York City compared to Albany, there's obviously going to be quite a different swing in what the land value is. I don't think you're buying a property in New York City for $100,000 though. So let's say your land value is $5,000. So your adjusted basis is $95,000. If you have a hybrid project, you would think that you could have your adjusted basis because half of your building is income producing. In reality, you have to get over that entire number on just the commercial side, the income producing portion of the building, to make that space eligible for the tax credits. So obviously, if you've got a building that's relatively in good shape and you're not needing to invest that much money in, it becomes problematic, if not impossible, for you to get over that entire adjusted basis to make the income producing side of your property work for this hybrid scenario. The name of the game is generally buy low, rehab high. So the crappier your building is at the start, the better off you probably are for making a successful hybrid project, or either just a straight homeowner project or a straight commercial project. So here's sort of an example of a row house, 4 stories, basement, first, second, third floor. Let's say you live on the 3rd floor, so you can maximize the 1, 2, 3 rental units below you. You're going to be earning 20% historic tax credits on the homeowner application for the unit you're occupying at the top of the building. You're going to be getting 40% for the second, first, and basement floors, assuming they're each an individual apartment. And then the exterior, like we discussed, is split between the homeowner and commercial equally. So again, just to recap some feasibility thresholds, is your building eligible? Generally, is it on the National Register individually, or is it a contributing structure in a historic district? There is another few ways to be eligible. Those are the most likely that you're going to encounter. Another one that some folks might come into is a local tax certified historic district, where your building is in a local historic district, so exterior changes are up for review by your local preservation board, but the fact that it's certified means that the National Park Service has given it its stamp of approval. So it's not on the National Register, but the tax credit benefits are exactly the same. A little bit complicated there. There's not too many of those that happen nowadays. It was sort of a popular mechanism a while ago, but we do still see them once in a while. So those are pretty much the two ways: in a National Register district or individually listed, sometimes in a locally tax certified historic district. Does your rehabilitation work qualify? Are you exceeding your adjusted basis on the commercial side? Are you spending at least $5,000 and at least 5% of your exterior work on the exterior for the homeowner side? Does your project rehab exceed your adjusted basis? Again, we'll talk over that again later in the presentation, because a lot of people struggle with getting that nailed down. And do you need tax credits, cash, or both? So what that's sort of leaning into is, do you actually have tax liability that will allow you to have that dollar for dollar reduction in your tax credits, or I'm sorry, in your tax liability? Or should you be thinking about selling on the market through syndication, which probably isn't a factor for most of the people that are attending here. We're not really going to cover it, but if people have questions about selling tax credits or syndication, we can talk about that at the end. So the standard substantial rehabilitation test. Your qualified rehab expenditures, your QREs, have to exceed your adjusted basis. Again, your adjusted basis is what you paid for the building, minus land value, minus depreciation, and plus improvements you may have made to it. The most common QREs are associated with hard costs, so your demo, your build out, your window restoration or replacement, your systems. You can include soft costs, so your architectural engineering fees, your historic preservation tax credit consultant fees. A lot of soft costs are eligible, maybe even some permitting fees. Again, it's important to have a good accountant who's comfortable with this on board so that if there ever is an audit situation, they can be in your corner to defend you against the IRS. Again, name of the game, buy low, rehab high. So now we're going to do a little bit of math, which I've made easy for myself. And hopefully it's easy for everybody to follow along. So this assumes a 2-unit house where, let's say in the lower unit, it's the income producing property, and in the upper unit, you reside in as the homeowner. So you've purchased the property for $50,000. Your adjusted basis is $45,000. You know, you bought it yesterday. There's no depreciation factored in, so that's not lowering your adjusted basis. There's no improvements you've made because you've just bought it yesterday, but the land value is $5,000. So you have to exceed $45,000 on the commercial side of it, the lower unit, the income producing unit alone. Your total project cost is $100,000. Great. You're going to be well above that $45,000 mark. You're not going to have a problem exceeding it. So the homeowner portion, 50% of the property, you're going to be spending $50,000. Multiply that by 20%, you're going to be seeing a $10,000 state tax credit, which is potentially refundable depending on your individual income situation. In the income producing portion, the downstairs unit, you're going to be spending the same $50,000, except here it's going to be worth 40%. So you're going to be doubling your money at $20,000. Unfortunately, the federal side of it is not refundable. The state side is refundable. So a portion of that will come back to you similarly to just the homeowner side of the project. So in total, you're going to be seeing about a $30,000 net gain of historic tax credits, some of which will be refundable as a refund check in your hand, the rest of which will just see a reduction in your federal tax liability. So all in, you've spent $150,000 and you're seeing $30,000 back, which is a pretty good return on your investment. So let's just get into some topical examples, because getting through the math side of things and if your project is eligible is one thing, but the thing that the homeowner application does leave out, because there's so much to go over, which is understanding for why it isn't in there, is what you're allowed to do. So if you're preservation minded, a lot of this stuff is probably straightforward. You know, if I've got my historic windows, they're probably going to want me to fix them. You know, if I've got my original layout, I really shouldn't be playing with it. Maybe there's some room to move, but generally you don't want to gut the whole place and change everything up. So we're going to go through a couple topical examples. There's a lot of great guidance out there. The preservation briefs are one. They're very in-depth information from everything from appropriate modifications to historic floor plans to things as complicated as making sure that your mortar is a good match and that you're cleaning the building in an appropriate way. The ITS bulletins, the interpreting the standard bulletins, they're probably a little bit more digestible. They're much more sort of bite-sized information, so they're more topical, like, you know, changes you can make to floor plans, how you can make those changes, and they actually provide bad examples too, so that gives you some idea of what you should and shouldn't do. So there are great resources out there in addition to these official documents. So let's look at a row house. So there's 10 standards. We're not going to go over every single one. We're going to sort of hit on the ones that are the most frequently seen. So we'll start with the first one. Property should not be used, or should be used for its historic purpose or placed in new use that requires minimal changes. So basically, if you have an intact row house with its original layout, whether it's been kept a single-family home or was built as a multi-unit or was converted to a multi-unit, you got to work with what you've got once the building's coming into the program. So in this example, if you look at the lower right photo, you can see we've got that arched way from the first floor stair hall into the front parlor. That's indicative that this building was likely used for professional use at one point, maybe a doctor's office where the doctor lived in the remainder of the house and saw patients downstairs or something similarly. So we don't want to erase that history, even if it might not be original to the building. It's been around long enough to be considered historic. So we want to integrate those features and try to do our best to keep those as part of the overall building's history. Maybe this isn't going to be having a commercial use anymore. Maybe somebody isn't going to be practicing from home or whatever the place was used for. But celebrating that history, as long as it's still relatively intact, is a good thing to think about integrating into your rehab. On the photo on the left, you'll see a typical example of what we most often see in row houses that have been converted from single family to multifamily, where the first floor had two or three entries into the front and maybe rear parlor of the first floor plan. I know if you are taking what was a single family home on 4 floors, including the basement, you don't need that many access points. You just need one entry door once you're inside the building. So what we want to do is, if we have those historic doorways still left, we like to sort of keep a reference to them. So we take the door off, we infill the opening with a fire rated wall assembly, and we'll leave the trim. This does a couple things. It still alerts people to what the original function of that space was, and there's a reversibility factor so that if people do want to go back to a single family use or do want to celebrate how the building was originally used, that option still remains, versus just completely wiping the trim off the wall, flushing it out, and making everything disappear. Here's a plan of a row house that we worked on Broadway in Albany, which had been pretty well decimated. The original layout is pretty much missing. You can see from the fireplaces on both sides, this had a front and rear parlor. The walls between those two spaces are gone. The staircase that was in the building was just temporary because the original one had collapsed. There really wasn't a lot to work with here, which allowed for a more modern layout. Not to say you couldn't make changes like this if the building was more intact, but you just have to be more sensitive about how you're going about it. So here, rather than returning the original double parlor configuration, the 2 parlors effectively stayed combined into one and then became an open kitchen and living space. Bathroom was located at the central core, and then a bedroom was located at the rear. This was I don't know who wouldn't want this bathroom, maybe with some privacy film on the glass, depending on how you feel about that sort of thing. But this was a great reuse of this feature, where this oriole on the side of the building, relatively invisible from the front elevation, but clearly visible along the side, originally sat within the rear parlor, which was completely decimated from its layout, and then integrated into the new bathroom, which this is one of my favorite bathrooms in any of the buildings that we've done. Again, this is one in that row. You can see how bad we were starting off, but there was still some good stuff left. We had window casings. We had some fireplace mantles that were still present. On the back of the building, we had this really great oriole that was hung off the back corner of the building, sort of at a 45-degree angle, where the curved doors into it were still retained. And we sought to integrate those changes into the new layout and retain as many of the historic features as we could. Now, people who are a little bit eagle-eyed will note that the mantelpiece you're seeing in the after isn't the same as the before. That's because when rehabilitation of the building started, there was further collapse. So the owner opted to go and get some mantelpieces from the salvage market that were appropriate for the building. Changes over time. So we sort of discussed this a little bit with that other row house example, where the first floor probably had a commercial use and had that archway integrated into the space. So there's good changes and there's bad changes. So here we've got an example from Troy, this great Carrera glass storefront on a much older building. This storefront probably coming into play 30s, 40s on a building that was probably from the mid to late 19th century. Some people might come into that situation and say, I want to take this building back to the way it was when it was built. Well, this update of the storefront was an interesting thing for sure. Great materials. I personally love Carrera glass storefronts, and you wouldn't want to erase that from the building's history. Now, a lot of people might want to turn the clock back, but if those materials are already gone, there's really no value in throwing out something that is arguably historic in its own right, just to replicate something that's completely obliterated. So this change of a storefront, like so many changes in commercial buildings, speak to sort of keeping up with the Joneses and changing aesthetics of commercial districts over time, and it's important to keep those features. Below, there's an example of a not so good change over time. This is a row house we worked on in Troy as well, where you can see from the photo in the first slot what the building looked like during the Troy flood, what unfortunately happened to it, with the cornice being covered over, the 3-story oriole being yanked off, and a bunch of really terrible things happening to the front, and the end product, where we used our historic photos to effectively replicate that 3-story oriole and return the building back to some semblance of its historic integrity. Highly finished spaces. So I know, especially in row houses and commercial buildings and just individual standalone houses, there's obviously a lot of places that are this over the top and some that are more vernacular. But when you have places that have distinctive features and finishes like this, which had a 24 karat gilded ceiling and oak trim and doors and lincrusta on the stairwell and this great rathskeller in the basement with this imported tile from Germany, it would seemingly makes sense to most people. I'm sure those that are attending this, that you would keep those features. But sometimes we actually have to argue with people that no, you can't get rid of that, and no, you can't paint your natural finish oak gray, and no, you can't wall over your imported German tile with 12 by 12 porcelain tile. Just leave it alone. It's good stuff. It should stay. Repair, replace, and kind. This is a big one in our world. A lot of times, given the life cycle of these buildings, they've been knocked around quite a bit. Stuff has gone missing, but thankfully, if we're lucky, there's some stuff that still gives us an idea of what to put back. So this is actually all from one house we did here in Buffalo. The dining room trim you can see in the upper left corner. That was all that was left after a bathroom from the 60s was dropped into the dining room space, and it was enough to understand how to replicate the crown molding around the perimeter, what the width of the door casing was. In the bottom left corner, you see the music room. And although it might be a little bit tough to make out on your screens, you can faintly see the shadow lines of exactly how that wainscoting that was removed actually was designed. So that actually gave us a great blueprint for an authentic replication of the wainscoting in that room, which is currently still underway. And then the fireplace here, you know, mantelpieces can be basic, they can be over the top, and everything in between. With this house, it's tough to say how this mantelpiece was. It was on the upper floors, which were arguably just as nice as the lower floors. But we might not actually know how it was originally designed, but we can figure out what the width of it is, because clearly where the baseboards end, that's as wide as our mantelpiece was. You can see the discoloration on the hearth tile below. That seems to indicate that there was probably a pair of columns at either side of the mantelpiece. So while we don't know for sure what exactly to put back here, we can take cues from what remains of the physical evidence in the building to come up with something that's appropriate to put back, that sort of treads the line of not creating a false sense of history, but also being sympathetic to the style and nature of the house. Windows are always a big one. We're obviously a big proponent of saving and repairing and reusing your historic wood windows. Steel windows are a little bit trickier, especially in our climate. They just don't really tend to fare as well, especially with snow sitting on them year after year, after maybe a 100-year life cycle. So steel windows are most often replaced, probably with full aluminum units. Very few people opt to go with new steel units, although it is possible to have them made. There's actually a company in Jamestown that makes authentic steel replication windows. But wood windows are the ones that we're primarily concerned with. So from an application standpoint, if you have your historic wood windows, you should really always think first and foremost about keeping and having them repaired. If they are truly beyond repair, which sometimes they very well are, then you need to provide thorough documentation through photography that indicates these windows are beat and they can't effectively be repaired. And then you need to provide drawings that effectively show that your new replacement windows are going to match not only the overall design, so if you've got a 6/6 window, you're going back with a 6/6 window, but the fine details of things are coming in to match as closely as possible. So maybe your bottom rail of your window historically was 1 3/4 inches tall. If you're going to go with a modern window, it might not be possible to get a profile that short unless you're going to the custom market. It might not be an off-the-shelf size. So maybe if that profile needs to grow or shrink a little bit, that's not the end of the world. It's just if you're going from, say, 1 3/4 inches to 4 inches, that'd be a noticeable difference. You're always trying to get those things as close as possible if the original materials can't be reused. Gentlest means possible. This is pretty self-explanatory. You should do your best not to use methods or techniques that would actually have a long-term adverse effect on the building. Top left, you'll see what most brick typically looks like after it's been sandblasted. Not only does this take the finish off the face of the brick, but it almost guarantees that at some point that brick is going to have to be replaced because it's going to start absorbing water and cause problems on both the interior and the exterior. So sandblasting is always to be avoided. There's a lot of great products that are available. Low pressure wash might actually be able to do most of what you need it to do, but there are some products like Prosoco and Drummond make some really great paint stripping products. If you have the ability, the best thing for you to do is do some test patches. So here we've got a project we did in Rochester where it had graffiti painted over and then graffiti again. And we did 2 test patches one with just the pressure wash, and then one with the chemical product and a pressure wash. And as you can hopefully see on your screen, the example on the left didn't result in any long-term damage to the masonry, which is what you want. And that pretty much sums up the process and some topical examples. So I guess we can turn it over for questions, of which I'm sure there'll be hopefully plenty. And looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say.
Great, Mike. Thank you so much for that presentation. Obviously, there's a lot to learn, and so I would just encourage folks to not be discouraged. The folks at the State Historic Preservation Office are here to help you with your projects. We can also be of some assistance at the League. So please don't be overwhelmed if it's a lot of information. I had a couple of questions come through on the Q&A, so I'll just go through those real quick, and then we can take some verbal questions as well. Someone asked, how do you determine if the building is located in a qualifying census tract? This is a great question. We get this all the time. I believe Mike touched on it as well. The State Historic Preservation Office has an online system, CHRIS, which you can find on their website, and that's going to give you a way to look up to see if your building is eligible. I would say as a caveat to that, that SHPO is big on having you confirm with them to make sure whether it's in or out for sure. While CHRIS is pretty accurate, sometimes everything might not be up to date. So the best thing to do is really going to be to contact them to make sure that the answer you're getting is correct, whether that's a good answer or a bad answer. So that's the best way to handle that. Another question that came up is whether the New York State homeowner credit is available retroactively for energy efficiency, such as including a new boiler. Great question. Obviously, energy efficiency is one of those really important things, as I mentioned, that the tax credit can be really beneficial for. The guidance on this is SHPO is going to be your best friend. So you really want to get on board with them at the beginning of your project and be able to set forth, you know, what you're trying to do, what you'd like to accomplish. That being said, you can always contact them to just double check that something that you've already done will not qualify, just so that way you have an answer and they're going to be the final decider on those types of questions. Another question that came in is, if your adjusted gross income is over 60, how many years can the homeowner credit be carried forward? Great question. The last I had spoke with SHPO, they had said several years. I don't know, Mike, if you have a more concrete number that you've heard from them.
I thought it was unlimited, similarly to how the state commercial credit works, but I may be incorrect there. I don't know. Because there's such a credit cap, and because most projects don't really come close to hitting that cap, people generally don't have a problem absorbing it. I don't know. I'm not sure if there is a time period in which you have to absorb all of it, or if there is remainder after that time period if you lose out on what's left. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so again, we know there's several, so that's going to be another thing you should definitely check with them with. Okay, if people want to raise their hands, Mike, I think you have control right now, so you should be able to see on your panelist if you just want to see if people raise their hand, and then hit unmute for their mic if you see any hands pop up.
Sure, let me take a look here. Let me get out of this full screen.
So go ahead and raise your hands if you've got questions you want to ask verbally or confirmation on something I've already answered. Can you see those hands going up, Mike?
I can, I think. Let's see.
If you go to, I think, attendees or participants, you should be able to unmute them.
Oh, okay. Yep. Sorry. Let me take a look here. Oh, okay. I'm going to unmute Owen.
Okay, so Owen, go ahead and ask your question.
I don't have a question.
Okay.
Oh, okay. All right. Going back on mute.
Let's go to Anthony
here.
Anthony, did you have a question? He might be on mute still.
Okay. Let's see.
How about that?
Oh,
Yep.
There we go.
Okay. If you have a house that is going to be designated locally, does it have to get the federal tax credit? Does it have to be a national register as well?
Yep. Yeah. So in order to access the federal historic tax credits, it's tied to National Register listing, whether it's individually or within a historic district. So it's got to be on there one way or the other.
Okay, but applying for the local designation through SHPO and through the local preservation commission, it's pretty much the same application, or is it different?
When you say local designation, are you talking about a local historic district or individual local
Not
landmarking?
district, local individual
Landmarking.
landmark, right?
Yeah, individual landmarking, it varies from municipality to municipality. Generally, most cities try to make it easy for you to submit information on your individual property for local landmarking. The reality is that once you need to apply for the National Register, it's a substantially larger undertaking. Individual people do apply for their own houses, and actually it seems like people who aren't professional preservation consultants have a little bit of an easier time going through the National Register process. Park Service tend to be a little bit more flexible with individuals because they don't want to turn away the general public. But even if you have your property designated at the local level, it isn't necessarily a guarantee that the National Park Service is going to feel the same level of importance for that property on the National Register. It's probably a good start, certainly a foot in the door, but it's not always a guarantee that it's a one-for-one thing.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Mike, I had another question come through that you might know the answer to. Question is, for a larger building that is not a 50-50 split between homeowner and commercial, would you count the windows in each unit toward each historic tax credit program, or is it prorated based on what the square footage each use occupies?
Yeah, so that's always been a question for me. I think it falls under the same idea as the roof, right? So if you have the windows that are just for the homeowner unit and your windows for your income producing unit are fine, I think you still have to take that hybrid approach just because it's an exterior envelope element, if that makes sense. I don't know. I've asked topical questions about that before, and the answers are a little bit tricky. I don't know that at the state level, not the SHPO level, but the actual state taxation department level, if they have the level of minutia to designate between the two, whether you need to create a hybrid for the type of feature or if it's just straight 20%, no questions asked. But I think the general rule of thumb is that you would have to take the hybrid approach.
Great, thanks. And one other question, can you reapply for the commercial credits similar to the homeowner program?
Yes, yeah. So after your 5-year recapture period, if you want to embark on another commercial tax credit project for the same property, you can, but you then have to exceed your new adjusted basis. So if you've pumped a bunch of money into your property, 5 years down the road, 5 years of depreciation will be meaningful. But if you've spent a lot of money, like say, for example, you spent, I don't know, $200,000, and 5 years down the road, your adjusted basis is $175,000. You need a new roof that's only $25,000. You're not going to be able to get over the hump of that new adjusted basis with the improvements you've already made to the property.
Great, thanks. Anybody else have any questions they want to raise their hand and ask? In the last couple minutes we have here. Mike, I see Ellen has a hand raised.
Yep, let's see, participants. Okay. All right, you should be good.
Okay, go ahead, Ellen, with your question. Ellen, are you there? I don't think we have her.
Okay.
Anyone else have a question in the last couple of minutes we have? I just saw a question come through. What is the general cost range for hiring a consultant or accountant to assist with applying for historic tax credits?
Sure. I can't speak to an accountant. I guess it depends on how complicated the project is. Homeowner applications, like strictly homeowner applications, we generally don't do. just because they tend to be straightforward enough that if you were to say just apply for the historic homeowner tax credit, you could call the folks at the State Historic Preservation Office and they'd be able to walk through a lot of what would be okay and what wouldn't be okay. So most people are able to find their way through that process. If it's a hybrid project, again, you know, we're on hand to help those. I don't think we've ever actually handled a hybrid project because they're so rare. My own house is actually one, which is why I sort of focus on this, because it's a great use of it. But for a strictly commercial project, it depends on a lot of things. If the building is on the National Register already, huge advantage, because it's a lot less work for us to do, so we don't have to write a National Register nomination. If it's in a historic district already, that's a lot less work, so the cost is going to go down. If the building has a high amount of original integrity and there's difficult changes or design features that we're going to have to negotiate, maybe not get all or a lot of with both agencies, then obviously there's a factor there. So it's sort of tough to say without knowing building size, complication level of the project, and National Register status for sure. But if you have specific questions about a project you're working on, you can always email me and I'd be happy to talk about it offline.
Yeah, I think we see a lot, particularly in New York, where there's so many different regions. It varies greatly depending on where you are as well. So yeah, definitely follow up with us with some more specifics, and we'd be happy to answer that. I just received Ellen's question, so we'll close out on her question, which is, I have an area that wishes to become a historic district. Is there a plan I can follow? It is a really unique and history-filled road. I'm here, but you couldn't hear me. So great question. So everybody's need for preservation is a little bit different. And at the League, we certainly work to help people fulfill what they're seeking for their municipality in the best way possible. So for some, that's recognizing things honorifically, which would be the National Register route, getting it listed on the National Register, and then obviously making those qualify for historic tax credits is the real thing that makes that very valid. And then on the other side, there are municipalities who wish to locally designate, which will then come with a regulation component. So Ellen, I'd be happy to talk to you if you want to shoot me an email after and give me a little more information about your area and what exactly you're looking to do. I'd be happy to look into that for you in a little bit more depth. The State Historic Preservation Office obviously would also be able to assist, you know, once you're ready to fully begin the process. So I think we're going to close out here. I just wanted to thank everyone so much for joining us, particularly Mike, because that was a great overview and great information about really making these historic tax programs work for you. I know I learned a lot, and I hope you guys can take away a little bit of something from this presentation. And please don't hesitate to follow up with us. I'm going to send a follow-up email with a bunch of information and links to everyone so that you have all the information you need and all the contact info you need to go forth and get these projects done. So again, thank you everyone, and have a great day.
All right. Thanks everybody.